Avoid these sewing mistakes for success in your next sewing project. As you're sewing and you're using pins to connect your fabrics together and keep everything in place, you'll want to avoid sewing over the pins. This is something that people do to maybe speed up the process of sewing, but it's really dangerous. It's bad for your machine, it's not great for your fabric, and it's just not a practice that you want to keep. So as soon as possible, stop keeping those pins in your fabric as you're sewing. Just take the moment, pull out the pin right before you sew over it, and you're good to go. You could also use little clips instead of pins. There's many different ways that you could connect your fabrics together as you're sewing, but something I just have always used and loved are pins, but I never sew over them. When sewing, it's so easy to just gravitate towards the pretty fabric and get to work. I always recommend avoiding starting with a pretty fabric and just going straight to a muslin fabric, the cheap fabric, using curtains or bed sheets from the thrift store, and cutting that before you start your project. This is going to ensure that you're not messing up the fabric, that you know what the pattern entails, and that you end up with a great result when you do use your nice fabric. Speaking of fabrics, I always recommend not starting with stretch fabrics when sewing. Stretch fabrics are enticing to use because they are usually what you'll find in store-bought clothes and the clothes that you're gravitating towards. It usually comes in beautiful colors, maybe more so than woven fabrics, and it's soft. But the thing with stretch fabrics is there's a lot of nuance to it. It's not necessarily what you want to start with. It's something that you want to use when you have the right tools and materials, and so I always recommend just starting with a woven fabric. The cotton is your safest bet, and even more so, like I talked about earlier, starting with muslin fabric or thrifted fabric and practicing before using that nice fabric. When you get in the flow, it's so easy to forget the little things. So I want to remind you to finish your seams as you go. This is something you can do with a zigzag stitch or a serger. I have videos about this if you're interested on how to finish a seam. You could even do French seams if that's something you want for a cleaner look. When you skip finishing the seams as you go, then you're going to end up with a product that is unraveling, it doesn't wash well, and you'll be sad that you missed finishing those seams during the sewing process. One of my favorite tools that is so inexpensive is a seam gauge. I have one right here. It's $4, maybe cheaper. It'll last you years, and this will improve every sewing project. It'll help you have the correct seam allowance for your project. As you start sewing, you'll kind of learn what seam allowances is, what it looks like in comparison to the lines on your machine and the presser foot that you're using. But I always just recommend just picking up your seam allowance as you're going, and you'll be able to just check and make sure that your garment is on the way to the right size. And then when you finish your garment, everything will measure correctly. Another mistake that you want to avoid is not changing out your needle. So sometimes when I'm finding that maybe my machine is skipping and it's not working optimally like it usually does, then the first thing I go to is changing out my needle and making sure that it's the correct needle for what I'm sewing. So if I'm sewing cotton that is thick, has some batting on the back, I just want to make sure that I have a needle that is strong enough to withstand sewing over these fabrics. If you're sewing a stretch fabric, if you have some practice with stretch fabrics, then you want a stretch needle. If you're sewing leather or denim, there's needles just for these projects. So keep them on hand so you can change them out easily, and it will make your sewing process a lot smoother. The next one is one I have avoided many times, but I've learned my lesson. I'm going to pass it on to you. A mistake to avoid while you're sewing is not ironing. I know that stopping to iron is just not always pleasant. It's not always what you want to do, especially when you're in the flow. But something that has helped me is to remember that it's part of the flow. It's part of sewing. Ironing is not something to skip over. It will make a drastic difference in your project, I promise. Something that I love, if you don't have an iron, I recently got this cordless iron, and I wish I had it years ago. And if you're in the market for an iron, it's a great option. Another one of my most important and most used tools is my seam ripper. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that you can avoid while sewing is just skipping when you made a mistake and not seam ripping. Seam ripping can take some time, but it's so worth it. Taking that extra time to fix your mistake won't only affect this project, but it's going to affect all your other projects, because I can tell you that you're not going to forget, and you're going to be less likely to make the same mistake when you seam rip and take that time the first time. So this is one of my favorite tools, and one of the tricks is to take the red little part right here, and that is going to be underneath the fabric, and you're going to slide the seam ripper through the seam. You're going to pick up those threads and tear them up a lot easier when you put the red little dot on the bottom, and hold the fabric tight in your hands. A big thing that you can avoid in the sewing process is not planning. Something about sewing that I love is actually the pre-sewing part. I love planning the end product, what I'm going to wear with the end product, how I'm going to use the end product, and even special details that I can add along the way, even finding the right fabric and seeing how this finished piece is going to fit into my wardrobe. I really think that even planning these steps is going to help your mind start thinking about the process, about the sewing, and it's going to just create a more smooth sewing experience for you. The last mistake I want you to avoid while sewing is to worry too much about things being perfect, studying and researching too much before getting started. This will hinder you from even starting, and everyone starts as a beginner, so don't let the fear of things not being perfect, not as your Pinterest board looks, as your inspiration photos look, let that deter you from stopping. That's why patterns are such an important part about sewing. It will just teach you so much along the way, and it will help you get started and take that first step. The more that you put off starting and beginning in any area of life, the harder it is going to be to begin. So I hope these mistakes that you can avoid helps avoid some things along the way. And as you do make mistakes, just remember that you can keep going to continue. You're going to keep learning that way. If you want some more sewing tips, inspiration, patterns, and ways to get started, click this next video.